At dawn on April 9th, 1241, a combined army of Poles, Germans, and Teutonic Knights formed up outside the town of Legnica in southwestern Poland. They faced a Mongol force that had swept across the steppes and into Europe. The Polish commander, Duke Henry II the Pious, commanded perhaps 25,000 men. The Mongol force numbered around 20,000. No one on the European side had fought the Mongols before. They knew little about them. The battle began at sunrise. Within hours, the Polish army was destroyed. Duke Henry was killed. His severed head was paraded on a lance. The Mongols collected the right ears of the fallen as trophies. The victory was complete, but then something strange happened. The Mongols did not advance further into Poland. They turned south instead. Within days, they linked up with another Mongol force that had won at Mohi, crushing the Hungarian army. Europe seemed defenseless, yet the Mongols pulled back. They withdrew eastward out of Europe and never returned. What happened? To understand why the Mongols stopped, you have to understand who they were and how they built the largest land empire in history. At its peak, the Mongol Empire stretched from the Korean peninsula to the gates of Vienna, from Siberia to the Persian Gulf. It covered about 9 million square miles. No single land empire before or since has matched that. The Romans, the Persians, the British, the Ottomans, none of them controlled as much continuous territory. But the Mongol Empire did not appear from nowhere. It began with one man, a boy born into a minor chieftain family on the Mongolian steppe around 106th. His name was Temujin. Temujin was not born into power. His father was poisoned when Temujin was 9. The family was abandoned by their clan. They lived in poverty. They survived on roots, fish, and small game. Temujin killed his half-brother when he was a teenager in a dispute over a fish. It was a hard land and it made hard men. Temujin slowly gathered followers. He made alliances. He fought wars. He unified the nomadic tribes of the Mongolian plateau. In 1206, at a great assembly called a Kurultai, he was proclaimed Genghis Khan. The name means universal ruler. Genghis did not just conquer, he organized. He created a new legal code called the Yasa. It imposed strict discipline. It forbade theft, adultery, and lying. It required loyalty to the Khan above all else. He reorganized his army into decimal units, squads of 10, companies of 100, regiments of 1,000, and divisions of 10,000. Commanders were chosen by merit, not birth. Communication was fast. A relay system of horse messengers could cover 100 miles in a day. Orders from the center could reach the edges of the empire in weeks instead of months. The first campaigns were against the Jin dynasty in northern China. The Mongols besieged cities, but they also learned from the people they conquered. Chinese engineers taught them siege warfare. Catapults, battering rams, gunpowder weapons. They adopted these techniques. They also recruited specialists, not just soldiers, but administrators, doctors, astronomers. The Mongol approach was pragmatic. You could surrender and join the empire, or you could resist and be destroyed. After Genghis died in 1227, The empire continued to expand. His successors divided the realm into 4 khanates, but the expansion did not stop. Under Ojdai Khan, the conquest of China continued. The Jin dynasty fell in Wentwithriefer. The Mongols pushed into Korea, Persia, and the Caucasus. In 1237, a massive army of 150,000 men led by Batu Khan invaded the Russian principalities. The cities of Ryazan, Vladimir, and Kiev fell. Resistance was brutal. The Mongols had a tactic: they would offer terms. If a city surrendered, it was spared. If it resisted, they massacred the population and burned the city. Word spread. Many cities surrendered without a fight. By 1240, the Mongols had reached the edge of Europe. They invaded Poland and Hungary on 2 fronts. The European armies were feudal levies, knights on horseback, slow to gather, uncoordinated. The Mongols were mobile, disciplined, and used feigned retreats to draw enemies into traps. At Legnica, that is exactly what happened. Duke Henry's knights charged after what seemed like a retreating Mongol unit. The Mongols turned, surrounded them, and shot them down with composite bows, while the European heavy cavalry could not maneuver. The victory at Legnica was followed by the victory at Mohyj. The Hungarian king, Bela IV, had assembled a large army and fortified his camp. The Mongols crossed the Sajo River at night, surrounded the camp, and destroyed the Hungarian army. It was the worst military disaster in Hungarian history. The king barely escaped. The Mongols spent the summer of 1241 ravaging the Hungarian plain. They reached the Adriatic coast. Europe trembled. The Pope called for a crusade, but no crusade was needed. In December 1241, the Mongols began withdrawing. Why? The answer lies in events far away. The great Khan Ojdai had died in December 1241 in Mongolia. The line of succession was not automatic. The empire required a Kurultai to elect the next Khan. Batu, the commander of the European campaign, was a grandson of Genghis, but he had rivals. He wanted to be present to influence the election, but he also distrusted the regent. The other Mongol princes demanded that he return. To remain in Europe would risk civil war. So Batu pulled back. The European campaign was over. That is the story often told. The Mongol withdrawal was a consequence of political necessity. But there is another factor. The European plains were not ideal for Mongol horses. The grasslands of Hungary were suitable, but further west the terrain was forested and hilly. The Mongol army relied on mobility. Their horses needed pasture. Beyond Hungary, the logistics became harder, and the European castles were difficult to take without siege equipment. The Mongols had not brought heavy siege machinery on this campaign. They had relied on speed. The decision to withdraw may have been both political and practical. After Batu returned, he did not become great Khan. He established his own Khanate, the Golden Horde, in the Russian steppes. The Mongols would raid Europe again, but never with the same force. The golden age of Mongol expansion was still ahead in other directions. Under Hulagu, they sacked Baghdad in 1258, ending the Abbasid Caliphate. Under Kublai Khan, they conquered all of China, establishing the Yuan dynasty. By 1300, the Mongol Empire touched 4 oceans. How did a nomadic people from the steppes manage to conquer the most powerful civilizations of the time? Partly it was military innovation. The Mongol composite bow was a weapon of exceptional power and range. It could shoot accurately at 200 meters. A Mongol rider could shoot while galloping, turn in the saddle, and hit a target behind him. Their armor was light but effective. Their horses were small, hardy, and could survive on grass alone. Each rider had multiple horses, rotating them to cover enormous distances at speed. The army was organized by the decimal system. Units communicated with flags, drums, and messengers. There was no confusion on the battlefield, but there was also a psychological component. The Mongols were ruthless. They used terror as a weapon. Cities that resisted were annihilated. The stories of their atrocities spread ahead of them. Some cities surrendered without a fight. Others were abandoned. Genghis himself once said, "I am the punishment of God. If you had not committed great sins, God would not have sent a punishment like me." The Mongol system of governance was also surprisingly effective. They tolerated all religions, as long as loyalty was given to the Khan. They employed foreigners as administrators because local experts understood the cultures better than Mongols. They built roads, improved trade routes, and established a postal relay system. The Silk Road flourished. Ideas and goods moved across Eurasia: paper, gunpowder, the compass, printing, mathematical concepts. The Renaissance in Europe later benefited from knowledge that had traveled from China and Persia through the Mongol peace. But the empire was also fragile. It depended on the leadership of a single Khan. When that Khan was strong, the empire expanded. When the Khan was weak, divisions emerged. After Kublai Khan died in 1294, the 4 Khanates drifted apart. They fought each other. The empire formally broke up, but each Khanate continued for a time. The Golden Horde ruled Russia until the 15th century. The Ilkhanate in Persia collapsed in the 14th century. The Yuan dynasty in China fell to the Ming in 1368. The Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia fragmented. So what remains? The Mongol Empire was not a unified state for long, but its impact was permanent. It reshaped the political map of Eurasia. It brought the East and the West into closer contact. It demonstrated that a nomadic people could defeat settled empires, not through superior numbers, but through superior organization, mobility, and ruthlessness. And it left a legacy that still influences modern boundaries, ethnic tensions, and cultural exchanges. But let us return to that morning in April 124. The men who died at Legnica did not know what they were facing. They fought for their land, their families, their religion. They were brave. But bravery alone does not stop an army that moves faster than rumor, that fights with discipline, that does not stop for winter or rivers or mountains. The Mongols seemed unstoppable, and yet they stopped. They left Europe because of a death in Mongolia. A single event 10,000 miles away changed the fate of a continent. That is how empires work. That is how history turns on the smallest decisions. In the coming segments, we will go deeper into the rise of Genghis Khan, the military tactics that made the Mongols unbeatable, the administrative systems that held the empire together, the daily life of a Mongol warrior, the women who influenced the empire, the siege of Baghdad, the rule of Kublai Khan, and the eventual fragmentation of the largest land empire ever built. We will examine what the Mongols destroyed and what they preserved. We will ask what could have been different. And we will try to understand how a handful of nomadic horsemen changed the world. In the winter of 1206, on the banks of the Anan River in what is now Mongolia, a council of nomadic chieftains gathered. They had come to elect a leader who would unite the warring tribes of the steppe. That leader was Temujin, a man who had survived betrayal, slavery, and the murder of his father. When the council raised him on a felt carpet and declared him Genghis Khan, meaning universal ruler, they did not know they were creating an empire that would stretch from the Sea of Japan to the gates of Vienna. But the weight of that moment was not lost on those present. The assembly, known as a Kurultai, had been called after years of civil war. The tribes had exhausted themselves fighting each other. Temujin offered something else: order, loyalty, and the promise of shared plunder. What happened in the years after 1206 was not inevitable. Temujin did not inherit power. He forged it from nothing. His father, Yesuje, had been a minor chieftain poisoned by rivals when Temujin was only 9 years old. His family was abandoned by their clan. They lived in poverty, surviving on roots and fish. When he was captured by a rival tribe, he escaped with the help of a sympathetic guard. He learned early that trust was dangerous and that alliances crumbled as easily as they formed. But he also learned that loyalty could be earned through justice, not fear. He surrounded himself with companions who were not from noble families, men whose status depended entirely on his success. These men would become his generals, administrators, and the backbone of his army. The first task was unification. Temujin defeated the Tatars, the Naimans, the Merkits, and the Karaids. He absorbed their warriors into his own army, breaking the old tribal structures and replacing them with a decimal system of tens, hundreds, thousands, and 10,000s. He appointed commanders based on merit, not birth. He forbade theft, adultery, and the kidnapping of women. He created a written code of laws, the Yasa, which governed everything from military discipline to the distribution of loot. He also created a personal guard, the Keshig, which served as both a bodyguard and a training ground for future leaders. By 1206, all of Mongolia was under one rule, but the steppe was only the beginning. To the south lay the Jin dynasty, the dominant power in northern China. The Jin had once been the overlords of the Mongol tribes, extracting tribute and playing one group against another. Genghis had a debt to settle. In 1211, he led his army across the Gobi Desert into Jin territory. The Jin army was larger, better equipped, and defended fortified cities. But the Mongols did not fight like a traditional army. They avoided pitched battles when possible, raided the countryside, and cut supply lines. They used siege engines built by captured Chinese engineers. They also employed psychological warfare. When a city resisted, they slaughtered everyone inside. When a city surrendered, they were spared. Word spread. Some cities opened their gates without a fight. The Jin campaign lasted over 2 decades, but by 1215 the Mongols had sacked Jiangdu, the Jin capital, present-day Beijing. The Jin emperor fled south. The Mongols had not yet conquered all of China, but they had broken the back of the most powerful dynasty in East Asia. Genghis did not stay to celebrate. He was already looking west. In 1218, a caravan sent by Genghis to the Khwarezmian Empire, which stretched from modern Iran to Uzbekistan, was massacred at the border city of Otrar. The governor had killed the merchants, suspecting them of spying. Genghis sent an embassy to demand restitution. The Shah of Khwarezm, Muhammad II, ordered the ambassador executed. This was not just a diplomatic insult. It was a declaration of war. Genghis had a saying, "If you insult the Khan, you insult the sky." That insult would change the world. The invasion of Khwarezm began in 1219. The Mongol army numbered between 100,000 and 200,000 men, a force that required months of preparation. But the Shah had an army of at least twice that size, garrisoned in fortified cities across a vast territory. He made a fatal mistake. He dispersed his forces, expecting the Mongols to siege each city in turn. Instead, Genghis divided his army into multiple columns, each led by a trusted general. His sons Chagatai, Ojde, and the legendary general Subutai. They struck not one city but many at once. The city of Otrar held out for 5 months. When it fell, the governor was executed by having molten silver poured into his ears. Samarkand, the richest city in Central Asia, surrendered after a single day. The Shah fled west, pursued relentlessly by Subutai and Jebe, 2 of the greatest cavalry commanders in history. They chased him across Persia, through the Caucasus, and into the Caspian Sea, where he died on a small island, abandoned by his own men. The pursuit did not stop with his death. Subutai and Jebe continued north, raiding Georgia, crossing the Caucasus Mountains and striking into the Russian steppes. They defeated a coalition of Russian princes at the Kalka River in Wuntwit-Wathri. Then they turned around and rode back to Mongolia. They had covered over 5,000 miles in 3 years. Meanwhile, Genghis himself returned to Mongolia in Wuntwit-Wafiv. He was aging. In 1226, he led a final campaign against the Tangut Kingdom, the Zaizia, a state in northwestern China that had refused to send troops for the Khwarezm campaign. The campaign was brutal. Cities were burned. The Tangut king surrendered and was executed. But Genghis never saw the final victory. On the 18th of August 1227, near the Liupan Mountains in present-day Gansu, Genghis Khan died. The exact cause is debated: battle wounds, a fall from his horse, or illness. His body was taken back to Mongolia and buried in a secret location. To this day, no one knows where. His death was kept secret until the Tangut capital had fallen. Then the princes and generals gathered for a new Kurultai. The succession had been planned. Genghis had chosen Ojdai, his third son, as his successor. Ojdai was not the most aggressive or the most charismatic, but he was a skilled administrator and a man of moderation. The empire needed consolidation, not more conquest, or so it seemed. Ojdai's reign from 1229 to 1241 was a period of continued expansion. He completed the conquest of the Jin dynasty in northern China. He established the capital at Karakoram, a city that became a center of trade and diplomacy. He built roads and relay stations across the empire, allowing messages to travel hundreds of miles per day. But Ojdai also had a taste for alcohol and pleasure. He drank heavily, and his health deteriorated. His death in December 1241, likely from alcoholism, triggered the withdrawal from Europe. But it also set the stage for a succession crisis that nearly tore the empire apart. After Ojdai's death, his wife Torjin acted as regent. She was a powerful woman, a Karaid princess captured in war. She managed the empire for 5 years, keeping the administration running and securing the election of her son Gayuk as Great Khan in 1246. Gayuk was suspicious of Batu, the commander of the European campaign. The two nearly came to war, but Gayuk died in 1248, possibly poisoned, before any conflict could begin. Another regency followed, this time by Ojdai's widow Monk's mother, but the real power shifted to the Talyuid family, the descendants of Genghis's youngest son Talyui. In 1251, Monk, Talyui's son, became Great Khan. He was a decisive and ruthless ruler. He purged the Ojdai and Chagatai families, executing dozens of princes and consolidating power under his own line. He turned the empire's attention to two major campaigns: the conquest of the Song dynasty in southern China and the conquest of the Abbasid Caliphate in the Middle East. For the Chinese campaign, he assigned his brother Kublai. For the Western campaign, he assigned his other brother Hulagu. The campaign against the Abbasids began in 1253. Hulagu moved slowly, gathering siege engineers from across the empire. He demanded submission from the Assassins, a sect of Nizari Ismailis who controlled mountain fortresses in Persia. When they refused, he destroyed their stronghold at Alamut in 1256. Then he marched on Baghdad. Baghdad in 1258 was the richest city in the Islamic world. It was the seat of the Abbasid Caliph, the spiritual leader of Sunni Islam, and a center of learning, trade, and culture. The city was defended by the Tigris River and massive walls. But the Caliph, al-Musta'sim, had made a series of disastrous decisions. He had dismissed his best general. He had failed to reinforce the city. He had rejected Mongol demands for surrender with arrogance. On the 29th of January 1258, the Mongol army arrived at the gates. What happened in the next 2 weeks was one of the greatest catastrophes in medieval history. The Mongols laid siege to the city from both sides of the Tigris. They built a causeway across the river. They used catapults, mangonels, and naphtha bombs. The city walls crumbled. On the 5th of February, the Caliph surrendered. Hulagu ordered the city to be sacked. For 40 days, the Mongols killed, looted, and burned. The libraries of Baghdad, containing centuries of knowledge, were thrown into the Tigris, turning the river black with ink. The Grand Mosque was destroyed. The Caliph was executed, wrapped in a carpet and trampled by horses, a death that avoided spilling royal blood. Estimates of the dead range from tens of thousands to over 1 million. Baghdad never recovered. The fall of Baghdad shocked the Islamic world. It marked the end of the Abbasid Caliphate, an institution that had existed since 750. The Mongols continued into Syria, taking Damascus and Aleppo. Only the Mamluk Sultanate, based in Egypt, stood in their way. At the Battle of Ain Jalut in 1260, the Mamluks defeated the Mongol army, using the same feigned retreat tactics the Mongols themselves had perfected. It was the first major Mongol defeat in the field. Hulagu, with his army depleted and his brother Kublai preoccupied with the succession after Mong's death, did not press the attack. The Mongol advance into Africa was stopped. Meanwhile, Kublai had been waging a long campaign against the Song dynasty in southern China. Mong died in 1259 during a siege in Sichuan. Kublai and his brother Arik Bok contested the succession. A civil war erupted that lasted 4 years. Kublai won, but the empire was fractured. The Khanates of the West, the Golden Horde, the Ilkhanate, the Chagatai Khanate, no longer accepted the Great Khan's authority. Kublai was the Mongol emperor in name, but his actual rule extended only over China, Mongolia, and parts of Central Asia. Kublai did not care. He was more interested in China than in the steppe. He moved the capital from Karakoram to Khanbalik, present-day Beijing. He adopted Chinese court rituals, built canals, and promoted trade. He completed the conquest of the Song dynasty in 1279, after a final naval battle off the coast of Guangdong. The Song emperor, a child, drowned, and China was unified under Mongol rule for the first time since the Tang dynasty. The Yuan dynasty, as Kublai called it, was the most successful of the Mongol states. It ruled China for nearly a century. Trade flourished along the Silk Road. Marco Polo, a Venetian merchant, served in Kublai's court and later wrote of its wealth and splendor. The Mongols introduced paper money, improved the Grand Canal, and established a postal relay system that could deliver messages across the empire in days. They also tolerated religions: Buddhism, Taoism, Islam, Christianity. Kublai himself leaned toward Tibetan Buddhism. But the Yuan dynasty was also a foreign occupation. The Mongols maintained a strict ethnic hierarchy. Chinese were forbidden to carry weapons and many were reduced to serfdom. The Mongols and their Central Asian allies filled the top positions. Corruption grew. The economy faltered. After Kublai died in 1294, a series of weak Khans followed. The dynasty declined, and in 1368, the Ming dynasty overthrew the Mongols and drove them back to the steppe. The other khanates followed similar paths. The Ilkhanate in Persia converted to Islam, but collapsed into civil war by the 133s. The Chagatai Khanate fragmented. The Golden Horde persisted longer, but its power waned after the 15th century. By 1500, the Mongol Empire was a memory, but what it left behind was immense. The Mongols connected east and west in a way that had never been done before. The exchange of goods and ideas was unprecedented. Gunpowder, the printing press, the compass, and astronomical knowledge passed from China to Europe along the Mongol trade routes. The Black Death itself likely traveled from Central Asia to the Crimea along the same routes. The Mongols demonstrated that a vast land empire could be governed, but also that it required constant leadership. When that leadership faltered, the empire could not hold. On a cold morning in April 1241, Polish knights charged a line of Mongol archers near the city of Legnica. They believed they were fighting for Christendom. They believed they could stop the barbarian horde. They did not know that the Mongols had planned this exact moment. The knights died on the field and the world changed. But the Mongols did not stay. They went home because far away in a felt tent in Mongolia, a man had stopped drinking. That man's name was Ojde, and his death, more than any battle, decided the fate of Europe. In the end, history is not only about the strong. It is about the moments when the strong are called away. The Mongol Empire was built on speed, discipline, and ruthlessness. It fell apart because no one could hold it together. And that is the lesson. Empires are fragile, even the largest one ever built. On the 14th of November 1274, a fleet of over 900 ships appeared off the coast of Hakata Bay on the island of Kyushu, Japan. It was the Mongol invasion force, assembled by Kublai Khan, the great Khan of the Mongol Empire and emperor of the Yuan dynasty. The ships carried an estimated 25,000 Mongol, Chinese, and Korean troops. They were armed with catapults, crossbows, and gunpowder bombs, weapons the samurai of Japan had never faced on this scale. The Japanese defenders, stationed on the beaches, waited with swords and bows. Everything seemed in place for a swift conquest. Kublai had sent envoys to Japan years earlier demanding submission. The Kamakura shogunate refused. The regent, Hojo Takemune, ordered the envoys executed and the coastline fortified. Now the fleet arrived. The Mongols landed and advanced inland. The samurai, trained in single combat, charged the Mongol formations. But the Mongols fought in disciplined units, using volleys of arrows and explosive bombs to break the Japanese lines. The first day of fighting ended with the Mongols pushing the defenders back. What happened that night, however, changed the course of the invasion. A typhoon struck the coast of Kyushu. Winds tore through the Mongol fleet anchored in the bay. Ships were driven against the rocks. Thousands of men drowned. The Mongol commander Liu Fuheng ordered a retreat. The surviving ships limped back to Korea. The invasion had failed. The Japanese called it kamikaze, the divine wind. Kublai did not accept defeat. He sent another embassy to Japan in Wontuo's Venfiv. The shogunate beheaded the envoys. Kublai planned a second invasion, larger than the first. He ordered the construction of a new fleet and the conscription of more troops from southern China. He also demanded that the Koreans build warships. The Korean king, under Mongol pressure, complied, but the burden on Korea was immense. Shipbuilders were worked to death. Forests were stripped. The cost of the second invasion drained the Yuan treasury. On the 9th of June 1281, the second Mongol fleet set sail. This time it was even bigger. Over 4,000 ships carried an estimated 140,000 men. The fleet split into two wings, one from Korea and one from southern China. They planned to converge off Kyushu and crush the Japanese defenders. The Japanese had learned from the first invasion. They built a stone wall along the coast of Hakata Bay, 3 meters high and stretching for miles. They stationed samurai archers behind the wall. They prepared small boats for night raids against the Mongol ships. When the first Mongol ships arrived in June, they found the wall. They could not land easily. The samurai held their positions. Fighting continued for weeks. The Mongols tried to flank the wall, but the Japanese coastal defenses held. Then, in August, the second typhoon came. On the 15th of August 1281, a storm struck the Mongol fleet again. Thousands of ships were driven ashore. Men drowned in the thousands. The Chinese and Korean crews panicked. The samurai waded into the surf and killed the stranded soldiers. The second invasion ended in catastrophe. Kublai never attempted a third. The failed invasions of Japan were not the only overseas campaigns the Mongols could not win. The same emphasis on speed, discipline, and massed cavalry that had conquered the steppe and the settled empires of China and Persia did not translate to naval warfare or tropical jungles. For every success like the fall of Baghdad or the conquest of the Song, there was a failure like Japan, or Vietnam, or Java. In 1284, Kublai sent an invasion fleet to Java, in modern-day Indonesia. The local kingdoms, Singhasari and Majapahit, were divided. The Mongols landed and fought a series of battles, but the Javanese Prince Vijaya, who had initially allied with the Mongols, turned on them. He ambushed the Mongol army and forced them to retreat to their ships. The invasion was abandoned. In Vietnam, the Mongols tried to conquer the Tran dynasty 3 times, in 1257, 1285, and 1287. Each time, the Vietnamese used guerrilla tactics, heat, disease, and the jungle terrain to wear down the Mongol forces. They never won a decisive field battle against the Mongols, but they never lost the war. The Mongols withdrew and Vietnam remained independent. These failures had consequences. The yuan treasury was drained. The currency, paper money backed by silver, began to inflate. Kublai had printed more and more notes to pay for his campaigns, but without enough silver reserves, the value collapsed. By the end of his reign, the economy was in serious trouble. The Grand Canal was repaired and extended, allowing grain shipments from the south to feed Beijing, but the cost of the canal itself was immense. The Mongol elite grew corrupt. Local officials in China became more independent. Banditry increased. On the 18th of February 1294, Kublai Khan died at the age of 79. He was buried in a secret location in the Kentai Mountains in Mongolia, according to Mongol tradition. His tomb was never found. His grandson, Timur, succeeded him as the second Yuan emperor. Timur continued Kublai's policies but lacked his authority. The Yuan dynasty remained stable for another 30 years, but the cracks were widening. The other khanates experienced similar trajectories. The Ilkhanate in Persia, after the death of Hulagu in 1265, saw a series of rulers who converted to Islam. The most notable was Ghazan, who ruled from 1295 to 13 Ghazan formally embraced Islam, changed the name of the Khanate to the Islamic Sultanate, and attempted to reform the administration. He built mosques, supported religious endowments, and tried to fix the economy. But the Ilkhanate had been built on conquest and looting. Without new conquests, the economy faltered. The bubonic plague, which began spreading across Asia in the 133s, devastated Persia. By 1335, the Ilkhanate had collapsed into multiple warring states. The Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia fragmented even earlier. The Khans of Chagatai's line fought among themselves. The region split into a western part, which adopted Islam and became the Timurid Empire under Tamerlane in the late 14th century, and an eastern part, which remained more traditional. Tamerlane, though not a descendant of Genghis Khan on his father's side, claimed legitimacy through marriage and by placing a puppet Khan from the Chagatai line on the throne. He built an empire that rivaled the Mongols in brutality, but it was shorter-lived. The Golden Horde, centered on the Volga River and ruling over the Russian principalities, lasted the longest. They demanded tribute from the Russian princes for over 200 years. The Russian cities paid in silver, furs, and slaves. The Golden Horde converted to Islam under Uzbeg Khan in the early 14th century. But the same problems emerged: succession disputes, economic decline, and plague. In 1380, the Russians under Prince Dmitry of Moscow defeated a Golden Horde army at the Battle of Kulikovo. It was not the end of Mongol rule, but it was a turning point. Over the next century, the Golden Horde splintered into smaller khanates: the Khanate of Kazan, the Khanate of Crimea, the Khanate of Astrakhan, and others. By 1502, the Golden Horde was gone. What remained was the legacy. The Mongol Empire had connected the Old World from the Pacific to the Mediterranean. The Silk Road reached its peak of safety and usage during the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace of the 13th and 14th centuries. Merchants, missionaries, and travelers could cross the entire empire without fear of bandits, because the Mongols enforced order along the routes. Ideas moved. Chinese mathematics and medicine reached Persia. Persian astronomy reached China. The use of gunpowder spread westward. The printing press, though invented in China centuries earlier, began to appear in Europe after the Mongol period. But the empire also spread diseases. The Black Death, the bubonic plague that killed a third of Europe's population in the 1340s, is believed to have originated in the steppes of Central Asia and traveled along Mongol trade routes to the Crimea. From there, Genoese merchants carried it to Italy, and it exploded across Europe. The death toll was so high that it permanently altered the economic and social structure of the continent, and it was the Mongols' trade network that made it possible. The Mongol Empire also left a memory. In the West, the name Genghis Khan became a byword for cruelty and destruction. In the East, particularly in China and Persia, the Mongols were remembered as barbarians, but also as rulers who had unified territories and promoted trade. In Mongolia itself, Genghis Khan is a national hero. His image appears on currency, streets, and statues. The Mongol Empire is taught as a golden age of Mongolian power and culture. At the heart of that memory is a question. How could a group of nomadic herders, with no written language, no cities, no industry, conquer the largest land empire in history? The answer lies in their system. The Mongol army was organized into decimal units, tens, hundreds, thousands, and 10,000s. Men who had grown up on horseback, hunting, and herding were naturally skilled riders and archers. Every soldier carried a bow, arrows, a lasso, a sword, and a leather shield. They could ride for days without food, drinking mare's milk and eating dried meat. They could shoot accurately at full gallop. They understood the value of speed, surprise, and deception. The Mongols also learned from their enemies. They captured engineers, siege specialists, and administrators from the civilizations they conquered. They used Chinese catapults, Persian siege towers, and Muslim accountants. They were ruthless but pragmatic. If a city surrendered, they spared it and incorporated its people into the empire. If it resisted, they massacred everyone and used the terror to convince the next city to surrender. This strategy worked for decades, but the empire could not survive its own size. The Mongol system required a single, strong leader to hold the khanates together. That leader had to be recognized by all the descendants of Genghis Khan. After Ojday's death, that recognition broke down. The civil wars, the succession crises, and the divergent interests of the khanates turned the empire into a loose confederation that eventually collapsed. The Mongols were never defeated by a single army. They were defeated by geography, distance, disease, and internal division. On the 1st of September 1260, a Mongol army of about 10,000 men under Kitbuka faced a Mamluk army of similar size near the town of Ain Jalut in Palestine. It was the first time a Mongol force had been decisively beaten in open battle. The Mamluks used the feigned retreat, the same tactic the Mongols had used against others. They drew the Mongols into a trap and destroyed them. Kitbuka was captured and executed. The Mongol advance into Africa ended. The battle is often seen as a turning point, a moment when the myth of Mongol invincibility was shattered. But the real turning point had come years earlier in a felt tent in Mongolia when a man stopped drinking. Ojday's death in December 1241 pulled the Mongol armies back from the gates of Vienna and changed the course of European history. The Mongols never returned. The question of what would have happened if Ojday had lived one more year will never be answered, but the historian cannot help but wonder. The Mongol Empire was built on speed, discipline, and ruthlessness. It fell apart because no one could hold it together, and that is the lesson. Empires are fragile. Even the largest one ever built. But the story does not end there. The fragments of the empire continued to shape history for centuries. The Timurid Empire, the Mongol Empire in India, the Russian Empire, and even the Qing dynasty of China all drew on Mongol precedents. The Mongols, who ruled India from 1526 to 1857, were descendants of both Timur and Genghis Khan. The Russian czars who overthrew the Golden Horde later adopted Mongol methods of taxation, conscription, and absolute rule. The Qing emperors of China, who were Manchus, governed using a mix of Chinese bureaucracy and inner Asian military discipline, much like the Yuan dynasty before them. The Mongol Empire also changed the way people thought about the world. For the first time, a single political entity stretched from Korea to Hungary. Travelers like Marco Polo, Ibn Battuta, and William of Rubruck crossed the empire and wrote about it. Their accounts opened the eyes of European and Islamic scholars to the vastness of the world. The Mongol period is sometimes called the first age of globalization. Trade routes, diplomatic missions, and cultural exchanges that had been limited or dangerous became routine. The Mongol Empire did not invent globalization, but it accelerated it. And then, in the early 20th century, the Mongols rose again. In 1911, after the fall of the Qing dynasty, Mongolia declared independence. In 1921, with Soviet help, the Mongolian People's Republic was established. It was a communist state, but it kept the memory of Genghis Khan alive. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, Mongolia adopted a democratic constitution in 1992. Today, Mongolia is a small country of just over 3 million people, but its history is still the history of the world. On a cold morning in April 1241, Polish knights charged a line of Mongol archers near the city of Legnica. They believed they were fighting for Christendom. They believed they could stop the barbarian horde. They did not know that the Mongols had planned this exact moment. The knights died on the field and the world changed. But the Mongols did not stay. They went home because far away in a felt tent in Mongolia, a man had stopped drinking. That man's name was Ojde. And his death, more than any battle, decided the fate of Europe. In the end, history is not only about the strong, it is about the moments when the strong are called away. The Mongol Empire was built on speed, discipline, and ruthlessness. It fell apart because no one could hold it together. And that is the lesson. Empires are fragile, even the largest one ever built. At noon on the 20th of April 1248, the great Khan Gayuk was traveling westward from Karakoram toward his cousin Batu's territory. He had been great Khan for less than 2 years. His health had been failing, and the journey was strenuous. Near the region of Samarkand, he suddenly died. The official cause was illness, but rumors of poisoning never died. Gayuk had been elected in 1246 after a contentious Kurultai where Batu refused to attend. Batu, the son of Jachai, controlled the western half of the empire. He had supported Gayuk's father Ojde, but he distrusted Gayuk. The tension between the two branches of the family had been building since Ojde's death. Now Gayuk was dead, and no clear successor existed. The empire slipped into regency. Gayuk's wife, Agul Kamish, took control of the government from Karakoram. She was not a warrior or a stateswoman. She relied on a small circle of advisors and attempted to maintain the status quo. But the Mongol system required a Kurultai to elect a new Khan, and no Kurultai could be held without the consent of all the major princes. Batu, the most powerful prince outside the central line, refused to call one. He had his own candidate, Mernk, the eldest son of Talyui. Talyui was the youngest son of Genghis Khan and had served as regent after Genghis's death. His family had been marginalized during Ojde's reign. Batu saw an opportunity to shift power. For 3 years, the empire operated without a great Khan. Agul Kamish's regency was weak. Princes from the Ojdade and Chagatai families began to act independently. Local governors in Persia and Central Asia ignored Karakoram. The Golden Horde under Batu expanded its influence without consulting the capital. The Yuan dynasty had not yet been proclaimed. That would come later under Kublai, but the seeds of division were planted. In 1250, Batu finally decided to act. He summoned a Kurultai in his own territory near Lake Issyk-Kul. Only his allies attended. The princes from the Ojdade and Chagatai lines boycotted. Nevertheless, the assembly declared Mernk the Great Khan. Mernk accepted the title, but he knew the election was contested. He returned to Karakoram and summoned a second Kurultai in 1251, this time with representatives from all factions. The Ojdade and Chagatai princes arrived reluctantly. They sensed a trap. They were correct. During the Kurultai, a conspiracy was uncovered. A cook in Mernck's camp confessed that several Ojdade princes had plotted to assassinate the new Khan during the banquet. The confession, likely obtained under torture, was enough. Mernck ordered a purge. The Ojdade Prince Shireman was executed. Others were exiled or killed. The mother of the late Khan Gayuk, Agul Kamish, was arrested and later put to death by being sewn into a sack and thrown into a river, a traditional Mongol punishment for traitors. The purge extended across the empire. Mernk sent investigators into Persia, Central Asia, and China to root out Ojdade loyalists. Thousands died. The families of the old ruling line were systematically eliminated. This was not a simple succession dispute. It was a reordering of the Mongol political structure. The descendants of Talyui now held the Great Khanate, and they intended to keep it. Mernk's brothers, Kublai, Hulagu, and Erik Berk, were placed in key positions. Kublai was given control of the eastern provinces. Hulagu was sent to lead the invasion of Persia and the Middle East. Erik Berk remained in Mongolia as a potential heir. Mernk's reign, which began in 1251, was marked by centralization and conquest. He reformed the tax system, standardized weights and measures, and continued the census started by Ojdai. He also launched simultaneous campaigns, one into the Song dynasty in southern China, led by Kublai, and another into the Islamic world, led by Hulagu. The goal was to complete the work of Genghis Khan, the conquest of the entire known world. But Mernk's ambitions were cut short. On the 11th of August 1259, during the siege of Daoyucheng in Sichuan, Mernk died. The cause was dysentery, or perhaps a wound from a Chinese artillery stone. The exact details remain unclear. What is clear is that his death once again threw the empire into crisis. The succession struggle that followed Mernk's death was even more destructive than the one after Ojdai. Kublai and Erik Berk both claimed the title of Great Khan. Kublai was in China, commanding the southern campaign. Erik Berk was in Karakoram, the traditional capital. Each summoned a Kurultai. Kublai's Kurultai, held in April 1260 at Kaiping, elected him Great Khan. Erik Berk's Kurultai, held in Karakoram a month later, declared him the legitimate successor. The empire now had two great Khans and neither would back down. The civil war lasted 4 years. It was not a war of pitched battles alone. It was a war of attrition, logistics, and loyalty. Kublai controlled the rich agricultural lands of northern China, which gave him access to grain, taxes, and a large sedentary population. Erik Berk controlled the Mongolian steppe, the ancestral homeland, and the loyalty of many Mongol nobles who resented Kublai's Chinese advisors and sedentary lifestyle. The war drained the empire. Armies marched across the Gobi Desert. Cities in the Tarim Basin changed hands. The Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia sided with Erik Berk, but Kublai's forces pushed them back. By 1264, Erik Berk was isolated, his supplies exhausted. He surrendered to Kublai in August of that year. Kublai spared his life but placed him under house arrest. Erik Berk died 2 years later, likely from illness or poison. Kublai was now the undisputed Great Khan, but the empire was no longer unified. The Western Khanates, the Golden Horde, the Chagatai Khanate, and the Ilkhanate had not participated in the civil war, or had participated only half-heartedly. They recognized Kublai's nominal authority, but they followed their own policies. Batu's successor, Berke, had converted to Islam and was focused on conflict with the Ilkhanate in Persia. The Chagatai Khans were fighting among themselves. The Ilkhanate under Hulagu had conquered Baghdad in 1258 and was engaged in a long war with the Mamluks. Kublai's authority extended over Mongolia, China, and parts of Central Asia, but the other regions had become autonomous. The word empire still applied, but it no longer meant a single command. Travelers like Marco Polo, who arrived in Kublai's court around 1275, saw a vast domain under one ruler. Polo did not visit the Western Khanates. He traveled from the Mediterranean through Persia and Central Asia, but once he entered Kublai's territory, he stayed there for 17 years. His account describes a unified China under Mongol rule, but that was only part of the picture. The Western Khanates had their own languages, religions, and alliances. The Ilkhanate favored Shia Islam. The Golden Horde adopted Sunni Islam. The Chagatai Khanate vacillated between Buddhism and Islam. The Yuan dynasty in China embraced Tibetan Buddhism and Confucian bureaucracy. The split was not just political, it was cultural. In the West, Mongols intermarried with Persians, Turks, and Arabs. They became part of the Islamic world. In the East, Mongols became part of the Chinese world, adopting Chinese court rituals, building a new capital at Dadu, Beijing, and issuing paper money. The unity of the Mongol Empire had been held together by personal loyalty to the Great Khan. When that loyalty broke, the empire broke with it. But the Mongol legacy did not end. The Timurid Empire, which rose in Central Asia in the late 14th century, was a direct descendant of the Mongol tradition. Timur, known in the West as Tamerlane, was a Turco-Mongol conqueror who claimed descent from Genghis Khan. He rebuilt the city of Samarkand into a center of art and architecture. He invaded Persia, Mesopotamia, the Caucasus, and India. In 1398, he sacked Delhi and massacred tens of thousands. In 1402, he captured the Ottoman Sultan Bayezid I at the Battle of Ankara. Timur's empire was brutal, centralized, and short-lived. He died in 1405 while marching toward China. His empire fragmented within a generation, but his descendants, the Moguls, would go on to rule India for more than 300 years. The Mongol Empire, founded by Babur in 1526, was a Mongol Timurid state. The word Mogul means Mongol. Babur was a descendant of Timur on his father's side and of Genghis Khan on his mother's. He wrote in his memoirs about the Mongol heritage, about the discipline of the steppe and the memory of conquest. The Moguls ruled a vast territory from Afghanistan to Bengal with a sophisticated administration, court culture, and military. They built the Taj Mahal. They were not nomadic herders, they were settled rulers. But the Mongol roots were never forgotten. On the 21st of April 1526, Babur faced the Sultan of Delhi, Ibrahim Lodi, at the First Battle of Panipat. Babur's army numbered about 12,000 men. Ibrahim Lodi had perhaps 100,000 soldiers and hundreds of war elephants. Babur used a tactic his Mongol ancestors had perfected, the chalugma, a flanking maneuver with cavalry. He also used gunpowder weapons, field fortifications, and carts chained together to break the enemy's charge. It was a decisive victory. The Mongol Empire was born. Babur wrote in his diary that night, "The battle was not easy, but the fortune of the Mongol house was with us." That fortune, however, was a memory. The Mongol Empire itself had vanished, but its methods, its bloodlines, and its stories continued. The Russian Empire, which grew out of the Grand Duchy of Moscow, had been a vassal of the Golden Horde for 2 centuries. When Moscow finally overthrew the Horde in 1480, it did not abandon Mongol administrative techniques. The Tsars adopted the Mongol system of taxation, the postal relay stations, the census, and the idea of absolute rule. Ivan the Terrible called himself Tsar, a word derived from Caesar, but his style of autocracy owed more to the Khans than to the Romans. In China, the Ming dynasty that overthrew the Yuan in 1368 continued to use Mongol military organization and border policies. The Great Wall, rebuilt under the Ming, was a response to the Mongol threat, but the Ming emperors also employed Mongol cavalry and granted titles to Mongol princes who submitted. The Qing dynasty, which replaced the Ming in 1644, were Manchus, not Mongols, but the Manchus had a long alliance with the Mongols. The Qing emperors married Mongol princesses, spoke Mongolian, and maintained a separate Mongol administrative system within their empire. The last great Mongol Khan to resist the Qing was Galdan Bashigtu of the Dzungar Khanate, who fought a series of wars in the late 17th century. He was defeated in 1697. After that, the Mongols became part of the Qing Empire, their independence extinguished for more than 2 centuries. And then, in the 20th century, the Mongols rose again. On the 1st of December 1911, with the fall of the Qing dynasty, Mongolia declared independence. The Bogd Khan, the Buddhist spiritual leader, became the head of state, but independence was short-lived. In 1921, a communist revolution supported by the Soviet Red Army established the Mongolian People's Republic. It was the world's second communist state after the Soviet Union. For 70 years, Mongolia was a satellite of the USSR. Genghis Khan was downplayed in official history, called a feudal oppressor, but the people remembered. In 1990, Mongolia peacefully transitioned to democracy. In 1992, a new constitution was adopted. The symbols of the Mongol Empire returned. Genghis Khan's face appeared on currency, on vodka bottles, on the national seal. A massive statue of him on horseback was erected outside Ulaanbaatar. The legacy of the Mongol Empire became a source of national pride. Tourism boomed. Historians argued about the true nature of the empire. Was it a brutal conquest machine or the first global civilization? The answer, like the empire itself, was complex. On a summer afternoon in 2023, a young Mongolian herder sat on a hillside near the ruins of Karakorum. He looked down at the Erdene Zu monastery, built in 1585 from stones taken from the old Mongol capital. The monastery had survived the communist purges, the Soviet era, and the post-communist revival. The herder's phone played a video about the Mongol Empire. He had seen it before. He knew the names, Genghis, Ojdai, Kublai. He knew the battles, Legnica, Baghdad, Xianyang. He knew the distances from the Pacific to the Danube. And he knew that his ancestors had built something that had never been built before and would never be built again. The wind blew across the steppe. The grass swayed. The empire was gone, but the land remained. And the story, the vast, brutal, astonishing story of the Mongol Empire, continued to be told. On the 1st of February 1346, a Genoese trading ship anchored at the port of Kaffa on the Crimean Peninsula. Kaffa was a fortified colony of the Republic of Genoa, a hub for commerce between Europe, the Black Sea, and the interior of Asia. The ship carried silk, spices, and furs. It also carried rats. The rats were infested with fleas. The fleas carried a bacterium called Yersinia pestis. Within weeks, the city of Kaffa was under siege not only by the Mongol army of the Golden Horde, but by a disease that had been simmering in the steppe for years. What happened in Kaffa would change the course of human history. The Mongol siege of Kaffa had begun in 1343, led by Jani Beg, the Khan of the Golden Horde. The city held out for months. Then the plague broke out among the Mongol troops. Contemporary accounts, including those of the Italian notary Gabriel de Mussi, reported that the Mongols used catapults to hurl infected corpses over the city walls. The defenders, already weakened, soon fell ill themselves. The Genoese fled by ship, carrying the plague to Constantinople, then to Sicily, then to Genoa, Venice, and the rest of Europe. By 1351, the Black Death had killed between 30 and 50% of the European population. The Mongol Empire had not caused the plague, but its imperial postal system, its trade routes, and its military campaigns had created the conditions for a pandemic that spread faster than any before. How could this have happened? The Mongol Empire, at its height, unified the entire Silk Road under a single administration. Caravans could travel from the Yellow Sea to the Mediterranean without encountering a single border checkpoint. The YAM system, the relay stations that could move a message 200 miles in a single day, also moved trade goods and travelers, and it moved disease. The bacterium Yersinia pestis had existed in the wild rodent populations of Central Asia for millennia. But as long as human settlements were isolated, the plague could not become epidemic. The Mongol unification of Eurasia erased that isolation. For the first time, a pathogen could travel from the eastern steppes to the Atlantic coast in a matter of months, riding the same roads that brought silk and gunpowder to the West. The exchange was not only biological. Under Mongol rule, the Silk Road experienced a golden age. Chinese engineers brought papermaking and printing to Persia. Persian astronomers introduced new instruments to China. The mathematical concept of zero traveled from India to the Islamic world and then to Europe. The Mongol court at Karakoram hosted Nestorian Christians, Buddhist monks, Muslim scholars, and Taoist priests. Kublai Khan himself sponsored a debate between representatives of different religions, asking them to determine which faith was true. The debate ended without a clear winner, but it demonstrated a level of religious tolerance unusual for its time. The Mongols did not impose a single religion. They used all religions as tools of administration and legitimacy. But the tolerance had limits. It was practical, not philosophical. A conquered population that was allowed to keep its faith was less likely to rebel. A Buddhist monk who could read the stars was useful for the imperial calendar. A Muslim merchant who paid taxes was welcome. The Mongols were not missionaries, they were pragmatists. Their rule was brutal, extractive, and often arbitrary. The census, the tax system, the massacre of cities that resisted, these were not compassionate acts. But within the framework of conquest, the Mongols created the first truly global system of communication and exchange. Consider the documentary evidence. The travel accounts of Marco Polo, the Franciscan friar William of Rubruck, the Moroccan scholar Ibn Battuta, all describe a world in which a traveler could cross continents with relative safety. Ibn Battuta, writing in the 14th century, traveled from Morocco to the court of the Mongol ruler in Delhi, then to the Maldives, then to China. He depended on the Mongol postal system for introductions and safe passage. He complained about the quality of the bread in the steppe, but he never feared bandits on the main roads. The Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace, was real. It lasted from about 1260 to 1350, roughly 90 years. In that time, the exchange of goods, ideas, and diseases reshaped the world. The effects of that exchange are still visible today. The genetic legacy of the Mongol Empire appears in DNA studies. A 2003 study published in the American Journal of Human Genetics found that approximately 16 million men in Asia carry a Y chromosome lineage that traces back to a single man who lived around the year 1000. The researchers estimated that this man was likely Genghis Khan and his close male relatives. The Mongol royal family, through its practice of polygyny and the distribution of conquered women, left an outsized genetic footprint. Other Mongol leaders, such as Jiakenga, the founder of the Qing imperial lineage, show similar patterns. The empire was not only political, it was biological. The cultural legacy is equally vast. The Mongol Empire introduced gunpowder to Europe, not through a single event but through the slow transfer of knowledge along the Silk Road. Chinese fire lances, early flamethrowers made of bamboo and gunpowder, evolved into the European cannon. The Mongol siege of Xiangyang in 1273 used Chinese trebuchets and explosive shells. 2 centuries later, Ottoman armies used similar technology to breach the walls of Constantinople. The Mongol Empire did not invent gunpowder, but it spread the recipe across Eurasia. Without the Mongols, the military history of Europe and the Middle East would have been radically different. The Mongol administrative system also influenced the modern state. The census, the imperial postal system, the use of standardized weights and measures, the concept of a paper currency backed by state authority, all these were innovations of the Mongol Empire. The Yuan dynasty under Kublai Khan issued paper money that was legal tender for all transactions. Marco Polo, writing about the Yuan court, described with astonishment how the great Khan could turn a piece of mulberry bark into a coin that everyone accepted. That system collapsed when the yuan printed too much money and inflation destroyed its value. But the idea of fiat currency survived and reappeared in Europe during the Renaissance. On the geopolitical level, the Mongol Empire redrew the map of Eurasia. The borders of modern Russia, China, Iran, and India all bear the imprint of Mongol conquest. The Golden Horde, which ruled Russia for more than 2 centuries, created a pattern of tribute and autocracy that the czars inherited. The Muscovite princes collected taxes for the Mongols, learned Mongol methods of administration, and then turned those methods against the Mongols themselves. When Ivan III finally stopped paying tribute in 1480, he did not create a new system. He took over the existing one. The Russian Empire, the Soviet Union, and modern Russia all contain elements of Mongol governance. Centralized taxation, a strong executive, a hierarchical bureaucracy, and a tradition of military expansion. In China, the Mongol conquest ended the Southern Song and unified the country under a single ruler for the first time in 3 centuries. The Yuan dynasty, though short-lived, established the boundaries of China that the Ming and Qing would later expand. The Mongol census of China counted more than 50 million people. The Mongol postal system linked Beijing to the Caspian Sea. The Mongol military campaigns in Southeast Asia, though unsuccessful against Vietnam and Java, introduced Chinese gunpowder and naval technology to the region. The legacy of the Mongol Empire in China is complex. The Mongols are remembered both as brutal conquerors and as the rulers who opened China to the outside world. In Iran, the Ilkhanate under Hulagu destroyed the Abbasid Caliphate and ended the Islamic Golden Age in Baghdad. The city, once the center of world learning, was sacked, burned, and its population massacred. The irrigation systems of Mesopotamia were damaged and never fully restored. The loss of the House of Wisdom, the libraries, the scholars, set back Islamic science by centuries. But the Ilkhanate also fostered cultural exchange. Persian historians like Rashid al-Din wrote world histories that included Chinese, Mongol, and European sources. Persian miniature painting absorbed Chinese artistic techniques. The Ilkhanid court at Tabriz became a center of trade and scholarship. The Ilkhanate eventually converted to Islam, blending Mongol and Persian traditions into a new synthesis that influenced later Safavid and Mughal courts. In India, the Mughal Empire, as already noted, was a direct descendant of the Mongol tradition. The Mughal Emperor Akbar, who ruled from 1556 to 1605, consciously modeled his court on Mongol precedents. He created a centralized administration, a revenue system based on land surveys, and a policy of religious tolerance that echoed the Mongol approach. Akbar invited scholars from Hinduism, Islam, Christianity, and Zoroastrianism to debate religion at his court, just as Kublai had done 3 centuries earlier. The Mughal army used cavalry tactics derived from the steppe, though it also incorporated gunpowder and artillery. The Mughal Empire lasted until the British Raj in 1857. Its collapse was slow, but the Mongol heritage remained visible in its architecture, its language, and its law. The Mongol Empire also shaped the modern concept of genocide. The destruction of entire cities, the mass deportations, the deliberate targeting of civilian populations, these were not new in human history, but the scale of Mongol violence was unprecedented. At the siege of Urgench in 1221, the Mongol army killed an estimated 1 million people. At the fall of Baghdad in 1258, the population of perhaps 2 million was reduced by massacre, starvation, and disease. Historical accounts vary, but the pattern is consistent. Resistance was met with total annihilation. The Mongols used terror as a strategic weapon. They spread stories of their brutality ahead of their armies to discourage resistance. In many cases, cities surrendered without a fight because they knew what would happen if they did not. That terror has left a lasting mark on the collective memory of Eurasia. In Russia, the word for the Mongol period is the Tatar yoke, and it is remembered as a time of oppression and backwardness. In the Middle East, the Mongol sack of Baghdad is still mourned as a catastrophe. In China, the Mongol period is often overshadowed by the achievements of the Ming and Qing, but the Yuan dynasty is studied for its technological and administrative innovations. In Mongolia, the empire is celebrated as the highest achievement of the nation. The statue of Genghis Khan outside Ulaanbaatar, the largest equestrian statue in the world, stands overlooking the steppe from a height of 40 meters. It is a symbol of pride, of resilience, of a people who once ruled the world. But what is the final balance of the Mongol Empire? Historians have debated for centuries. On one side, the empire brought death, destruction, and suffering on a scale that is difficult to comprehend. On the other side, it connected the world, spread technology, fostered trade, and created the first global civilization. The truth is that both sides are true. The empire was built on violence, but it was sustainable only through cooperation. The Mongol conquests killed millions, but the Pax Mongolica saved lives by preventing smaller wars. The Mongols destroyed cities, but they rebuilt others. They were illiterate themselves, but they employed scholars from every conquered culture. They had no religion of their own, but they patronized every religion they encountered. In the end, the Mongol Empire collapsed not because it was too brutal or too weak, but because it was too large. No pre-modern empire could maintain cohesion across such distances without modern communication and transportation. The successors, the Timurids, the Moguls, the Qing, were smaller, more stable, more culturally integrated. They learned from the Mongol failure. They kept the postal system, the census, the cavalry tactics, but they also built bureaucracies that were less reliant on the personal loyalty of a single ruler. The Mongol Empire was the prototype of the modern globalized world, but it was also a cautionary tale about the limits of power. At 2:15 p.m. on the 4th of July 1995, a team of archaeologists working in the Kentai Mountains of Mongolia uncovered a small cache of artifacts. They were searching for the tomb of Genghis Khan. The tomb has never been found, and many believe it never will be. The area is sacred, protected by law and by tradition. The Mongol government has banned archaeological excavations near the likely site. The tomb, if it exists, remains hidden beneath the permafrost, somewhere in the region where Genghis was born and where he chose to be buried. The legend says that his funeral procession killed everyone it met, that the river was diverted over his grave, that a forest was planted to conceal the location. The story is probably not true, but it captures something essential about the Mongol Empire: the desire to be remembered, the fear of being forgotten. The empire is long gone, but its echoes persist. In the DNA of men across Asia, in the administrative systems of Russia and China, in the gunpowder that shaped modern warfare, in the trade routes that became the basis of the global economy, in the stories of travelers who crossed the steppe and saw wonders they could not describe. The Mongol Empire was not the beginning of world history, and it was not the end. But for 1 century, it was the whole world. At dawn on the 15th of August 1281, a massive typhoon struck the coast of Kyushu, Japan. The storm came from the southwest, driving waves and wind directly into the anchored Mongol fleet. There were an estimated 4,000 ships in Hakata Bay, carrying perhaps 100,000 soldiers and sailors. By nightfall, the fleet was destroyed. Ships were smashed against the shore, sunk by the storm, or driven out to sea. The wreckage stretched for miles, bodies washed up on the beaches. The Japanese defenders, who had been preparing for a second Mongol invasion, watched from the shore. They called the storm kamikaze, divine wind. They believed the gods had intervened to save Japan. What happened? The Mongols had already attempted an invasion of Japan 9 years earlier in Wentwos-Venfer. That first invasion, also by sea, had landed on the same coast. The samurai defenders fought bravely, but the Mongols used tactics the Japanese had never seen: coordinated infantry and cavalry, volleys of arrow, explosive bombs fired by catapults. The Japanese fought individual duels, but the Mongols fought as a collective. After a day of fighting, the samurai withdrew to their fortifications. The Mongols, however, did not press the attack. That night, a typhoon struck the Mongol fleet. The ships rode at anchor and many were lost. The survivors sailed back to Korea. The first invasion failed. Kublai Khan, now Emperor of China and Great Khan of the Mongols, did not accept defeat. He sent envoys to Japan demanding submission. The Japanese executed the envoys, a grave insult. Kublai began preparing a second invasion, larger than the first. He ordered the construction of a massive fleet in the shipyards of southern China and Korea. The ships were built quickly, using green wood, and some historians believe they were not of the highest quality. The fleet gathered in 1281, split into two forces, the eastern route from Korea and the southern route from China. They were supposed to rendezvous in Hakata Bay. The eastern route arrived first in June. The Japanese had built a stone wall along the coast, 14 miles long, to prevent the Mongols from landing cavalry. The Mongols attempted several landings but were repulsed. They stayed at sea, waiting for the southern route. When that fleet finally arrived in August, the combined force was enormous. But before they could coordinate a full assault, the storm hit. It was not a typical seasonal typhoon. It was a super typhoon with winds that destroyed even large ships. The Mongol commanders were inexperienced in naval warfare in such waters. The Chinese and Korean sailors warned of the approaching storm, but the Mongols did not understand the danger. They kept the fleet at anchor, and they paid for it with tens of thousands of lives. How could this have happened? The Mongols were masters of land warfare, but the sea was unfamiliar. Kublai Khan had conquered China using land-based armies and river fleets, but open ocean operations were different. He underestimated the logistical challenge of transporting an army across the Sea of Japan. He also underestimated the determination of the samurai. The Japanese had learned from the first invasion. They built defenses, changed their tactics, and waited. They did not seek a decisive battle on the beach. Instead, they harassed the Mongol fleet with fast boats at night, boarding and burning ships. The Mongols had no answer. They could not bring their cavalry to bear. The storm finished what the samurai had started. The failure of the Mongol invasions of Japan had consequences. In Japan, the samurai class was strengthened. The kamikaze myth became a central part of Japanese identity, the idea that the islands were protected by divine forces. The military government of the Kamakura shogunate survived, though the cost of defending against the Mongols strained the treasury. In the long term, the successful defense contributed to a sense of national unity. In China, the failure was a blow to Kublai's prestige. He had spent enormous resources on the fleet, and the loss weakened his economy. He never attempted another invasion of Japan. The Mongol Empire had reached its eastern limit, but the story of the Mongol invasions of Japan is not simply a story of a storm. It is a story of ambition, miscalculation, and the limits of power. The Mongols had conquered the largest land empire in history, but they could not conquer islands defended by a determined enemy and a hostile sea. The invasions also reveal the technological and organizational challenges of amphibious warfare. The Mongols used Chinese shipbuilders, Korean sailors, and Mongol commanders, but the coordination between these groups was poor. The ships were built for river transport, not ocean voyages. The logistics of supplying 100,000 men by sea were overwhelming. The Mongols had to bring everything: food, water, horses, weapons, siege engines. They could not live off the land in Japan because the land fought back. The failure in Japan stands in contrast to the successes elsewhere. The Mongols conquered Korea, Vietnam, Burma, and Java, though not without difficulty. In Vietnam, the Mongols invaded 3 times between 1258 and 1288, and all 3 times they were defeated. The Vietnamese used guerrilla tactics, scorched earth, and the difficult terrain of the Red River Delta. The Mongols could not supply their cavalry in the jungle. They eventually withdrew and acknowledged Vietnamese independence. In Java, a Mongol fleet invaded in 1293, but the local king tricked the Mongols into supporting his own coup, then turned on them and forced them to leave. The Mongols never returned. These failures, like the failure in Japan, show that the Mongol military machine, though formidable, was not invincible. It depended on open terrain, on supply lines that could support cavalry, on enemy armies that would stand and fight. Against naval powers, fortified islands, or jungle kingdoms, the Mongols struggled. Their strength was mobility, but mobility could be neutralized. Their strength was terror, but terror only works if the enemy knows you can actually destroy them. In Japan, the enemy was willing to die, and the sea was a barrier that could not be crossed. The Mongol invasions of Japan also had a cultural impact on both sides. In Japan, the Kamakura period saw a flourishing of art and literature that reflected the crisis. The tale of the hike, while written earlier, was performed and copied during this time, emphasizing themes of impermanence and heroism. The samurai code of Bushido, the way of the warrior, was influenced by the need for discipline and loyalty in the face of a foreign threat. In China, the Yuan dynasty continued, but the failure undermined the emperor's authority. Kublai died in 1294, and his successors were weaker. The empire began to fracture into warring khanates, each pursuing its own interests. The Mongol fleet that sank in Hakata Bay remains on the seabed. Archaeological investigations in the 20th century found artifacts, anchors, cannonballs, bones, and pieces of ships. They confirm the scale of the disaster. It is a reminder that the largest land empire in history could not master the sea. The ocean, like the desert, had its own rules. The Mongols adapted to the desert, but they never fully adapted to the ocean. In the centuries after the invasions, Japan remained isolated. But the Mongol threat changed its military structure. The shogunate built fortifications, maintained a standing army in Kyushu, and developed coastal defenses. The legacy of the kamikaze persisted into the 20th century, when Japanese pilots used the name for suicide attacks during World War II. The divine wind became a symbol of national sacrifice. The historical accuracy of the story matters less than its emotional power. So what is the final lesson of the Mongol invasions of Japan? It is the lesson that even the most powerful empire has its breaking point, that geography and weather can be more formidable than any army, that defeat can be as informative as victory. The Mongols learned the limits of their power, but they did not accept them. They tried again, and again, and again, until they could not try any more. The Japanese learned that survival depends not only on courage but on preparation, on building walls and watching the horizon. The two cultures met briefly and violently, and then they parted, leaving behind a story that still resonates. Now, more than 700 years later, the seabed off Kyushu holds the silent wreckage of the Mongol Empire, a reminder that no conquest is final, that the wind answers to no one. At 11:30 a.m. on the 3rd of September, 1260, a Mamluk army of perhaps 20,000 men moved through the Jezreel Valley in Palestine. Ahead lay the springs of Ain Jalut, a water source that had been used for centuries. The Mamluks were not the only force in the region. A Mongol army under the commander Kitbuka had been sweeping through Syria, sacking Aleppo and Damascus, and pushing toward Egypt. Kitbuka's forces numbered around 10,000, but they were battle-hardened and confident. They believed the Mongols were unstoppable. The Mamluks intended to test that belief. The Mongol army at Ain Jalut was a mixed force of Mongols, Turkic auxiliaries, and Georgians. Kitbuka was a Nestorian Christian and a trusted general under Hulagu, the Mongol ruler of the Ilkhanate. Hulagu had left Kitbuka to hold Syria while he returned to Mongolia following the death of the great Khan Murk. That departure weakened the Mongol presence. Kitbuka was isolated from reinforcements, but he did not believe the Mamluks would risk open battle. He was wrong. The Mamluks had prepared carefully. They had made an alliance with the Crusader states, securing passage through their lands. The Crusaders, seeing the Mongols as a greater threat, allowed the Mamluks to march north. The Mamluk Sultan, Qutuz, and his general Baybars had developed a plan. They knew the Mongols were reliant on their horse archers and their mobility. They also knew the ground around Ain Jalut was uneven, with hills and ravines that could conceal a reserve force. The battle began in the morning. The Mamluks advanced, but they did not charge headlong. Baybars led the vanguard in a feigned retreat. He drew the Mongols into a narrow valley, then turned and struck. The Mongols pursued enthusiastically, believing they had broken the Mamluk line. But behind the hills, Qutuz had hidden the main Mamluk army. When the Mongols were fully engaged, Qutuz committed his reserves. The Mamluks surged forward, surrounding the Mongol force. Kitbuka realized too late that he had been lured into a trap. He tried to regroup, but the Mongol formations were broken. The Mamluks had better armor and their horses were fresher. The Mongols fought fiercely. Kitbuka himself was captured. He was brought before Qutuz, who offered him a choice. Kitbuka refused to surrender and was executed. His death ended the battle. What happened at Ain Jalut was not just a military defeat. It was the first time the Mongols had been decisively beaten in a pitched battle since the death of Genghis Khan. It shattered the aura of invincibility. The Mongols had been defeated before, but usually by weather or distance. At Ain Jalut, they were outmaneuvered and outfought. After the battle, the Mamluks pressed north. They recaptured Damascus, Aleppo, and all of Syria. The Mongols never returned in force. The Ilkhanate continued to exist, but its western border was fixed. The Mamluk Sultanate became the dominant power in the Middle East for the next 2 centuries. How could this have happened? The Mongols had conquered from Korea to the Danube, but they had not faced an enemy like the Mamluks. The Mamluks were slave soldiers, trained from childhood in warfare. They understood horse archery as well as the Mongols. They had better steel for swords and better mail. They also had a centralized command structure. Unlike the fragmented Mongol leadership after Murnk's death, the Mamluks were united. The Battle of Ain Jalut marked a turning point. It preserved the Islamic world from further Mongol conquest, saved Egypt and North Africa, and gave the Mamluks control of the Holy Land. It also demonstrated that the Mongol military system had weaknesses: over-reliance on mobility, difficulty coordinating large forces across long distances, and vulnerability when their preferred tactics were countered. But the Mongol Empire did not collapse overnight. It fragmented into 4 major khanates: the Yuan dynasty in China, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Golden Horde in Russia, and the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia. Each khanate pursued its own interests. The unity forged by Genghis Khan was broken by the succession struggles after Murnk's death. The empire had become too large to govern from a single capital. The Mongol way of ruling, which depended on a charismatic leader and loyal generals, could not survive the absence of a clear line of succession. From 1260 onward, the khanates warred with each other. Kublai Khan in China fought his brother Arik Burk for the title of Great Khan. The Golden Horde and the Ilkhanate clashed over the Caucasus. The Chagatai Khanate raided both. These internal conflicts drained resources and prevented coordinated expansion. The Mongols turned their swords on each other. In the decades that followed, the Mongol Empire stopped growing. The frontiers stabilized. The Ilkhanate adopted Islam and made peace with the Mamluks. The Golden Horde became Muslim and settled into Russian steppe life. The Yuan dynasty focused on ruling China, building a canal system, supporting Buddhism and Taoism. The Mongol warrior culture faded, replaced by urban life and bureaucracy. The Black Death, which swept through Asia and Europe in the 14th century, reduced populations everywhere. The Mongols, connected by trade routes, carried the plague. It returned to them as well. The plague weakened the Golden Horde and devastated the Yuan dynasty. Rebellions broke out in China. In 1368, the Yuan dynasty fell to the Ming, and the Mongols retreated to the steppe. The Chagatai Khanate broke into smaller states. The Ilkhanate dissolved after the death of its last ruler in 1335. The Golden Horde continued but fragmented into the Khanates of Crimea, Kazan, and Astrakhan. The Mongol Empire was gone, but its legacy remained. The Mongols had connected east and west like no one before. The Silk Road flourished under their protection. Merchants, missionaries, and travelers moved freely from China to Persia to Europe. The postal system, the yam, was adopted by later empires. Paper money, gunpowder, printing, and the compass spread from China to the West. The Mongols did not invent these things, but they enabled their transmission. In Russia, Mongol rule left its mark on politics, taxation, and military organization. The princes of Moscow became tax collectors for the Golden Horde, then turned that power into a new Russian state. In Persia, Mongol rule brought destruction but also cultural exchange. Persian historians wrote histories of the Mongols, and Mongol rulers built mosques and observatories. In China, the Yuan dynasty used Chinese officials and adopted Confucian rituals, but the Mongols remained separate. The Yuan left behind a unified China, a reformed legal system, and an expanded Grand Canal. The Mongols are remembered as conquerors, but they were also builders. They built cities, roads, and postal stations. They codified laws and collected taxes. They allowed religious freedom. They were tolerant of Buddhism, Islam, Christianity, and Taoism. Their empire was a laboratory of multiculturalism, though it was built on violence. The question remains, did the Mongols accomplish anything lasting? The answer depends on perspective. They changed the genetic and cultural makeup of Eurasia. They created a world where goods and ideas moved faster than ever before. They destroyed old dynasties and created new ones. They caused immense suffering but also contributed to the global exchange that shaped the modern world. The Mongol Empire was the largest land empire ever built. It covered 24 million square kilometers, from Korea to Hungary, from Siberia to Persia. It contained 100 million people, speaking dozens of languages. It lasted in some form for over 200 years. It was an empire of horse archers, felt tents, and steel discipline. It was also an empire of contradictions, brutal but tolerant, nomadic but bureaucratic, Chinese one day and Persian the next. In the end, the Mongol Empire collapsed because of the very forces that had made it possible. The steppe could not sustain a sedentary empire. The Mongols could conquer cities but could not transform themselves into city dwellers without losing their identity. They tried, and they failed. The empire fractured along cultural and religious lines. The Mongols returned to the steppe, to the grass and the wind and the endless horizon. But they had left marks on the world that could not be erased. The map of Eurasia was redrawn. The genetic heritage of the Khans lives on. The stories of their conquests have been told by chroniclers and historians for 7 centuries. The Mongols are not forgotten. Their empire was a brief, violent, extraordinary chapter in the history of the world, and it changed everything. Now, more than 500 years after the last Mongol Khanate fell, we still study their strategies, their leadership, their mistakes. We remember the siege of Baghdad, the sack of Samarkand, the invasions of Japan. We remember the riders who crossed deserts in a day and the generals who commanded 100,000 men. We remember the dust and the blood and the silence of the steppe after they had passed. The Mongol Empire is gone, but its shadow stretches across the centuries. The wind that carried the Mongols to the edges of the known world still blows. And somewhere on the plains of Mongolia, a horseman rides alone, a descendant of the Khans, carrying a memory that cannot be buried. On the 1st of July, 1999, a team of archaeologists and geneticists assembled in the remote province of Kentai, Mongolia. They were searching for the tomb of Genghis Khan. No one had ever found it. The expedition was funded by a wealthy American, and it used ground-penetrating radar, satellite imagery, and old manuscripts. The local guides warned them not to disturb the land. They said a curse would fall on anyone who opened the Khan's grave. The team found nothing. They returned empty-handed. This search was not the first. It would not be the last. The burial place of Genghis Khan has remained a secret for almost 800 years. According to the secret history of the Mongols, the army that accompanied his funeral procession killed every living thing they encountered along the route. Then they buried him in a grave dug deep into the earth, covered it with soil, and had horses trample the ground until no trace remained. A river was diverted over the grave to hide it forever. The soldiers who knew the location were all killed. The secret died with them, but the legend did not die. Over the centuries, treasure hunters, historians, and adventurers have tried to find the tomb. Soviet archaeologists searched in the 1920s and again in the 1960s. Japanese teams used advanced scanning technology in the 1990s. All failed. Some believe the tomb is in the Kentai Mountains near the Annan River, where Genghis Khan was born. Others think it is somewhere near the Orkhon Valley, where he established his capital. The ground refuses to give up its secret. What happened to the memory of the empire while the tomb remained hidden? The Mongol Empire lived on in oral traditions, in the epic poems of the steppe, and in the written histories of the Chinese, Persians, and Europeans. But the physical evidence was sparse. The Mongols built few permanent structures. Their palaces were made of felt and timber. Their cities, like Karakoram, were dismantled or abandoned. The empire left behind bones, arrowheads, and the rusting blades of swords. But it left no grand temples, no stone statues, no pyramids. In the early 21st century, a new kind of evidence emerged. In 2003, a team of geneticists published a study in the American Journal of Human Genetics. They examined Y chromosome samples from men across Central Asia, Mongolia, and the Middle East. They found that approximately 0.5% of the world's male population, roughly 16 million men, shared a distinctive Y chromosome lineage. The lineage was estimated to have originated around the year 1000, roughly the time of Genghis Khan. The pattern of distribution matched the boundaries of the Mongol Empire. How could this have happened? The geneticists proposed that the lineage spread through the reproductive success of a single powerful male lineage, likely Genghis Khan and his direct descendants. The Mongol Khans practiced polygamy and took many wives and concubines from conquered populations. Their sons inherited the empire and continued the pattern. Over generations, the Khan's Y chromosome spread across Eurasia. The study did not prove that Genghis Khan was the specific ancestor, but the timing and geography made it the strongest candidate. This finding changed how people thought about the Mongol legacy. It was no longer just a story of conquest and destruction. It was a biological footprint. The DNA of the Khans was still alive, carried by farmers in China, herders in Kazakhstan, and merchants in Uzbekistan. The empire had not disappeared. It had dissolved into the bloodstream of humanity. But the genetic evidence also raised new questions. If the Khan's lineage was so successful, what did that say about the social structure of the Mongol Empire? It confirmed what historians had long suspected. The Mongols were not just conquerors, they were settlers of a kind. They inserted themselves into the ruling elites of the lands they conquered. They married local princesses, took local concubines, and placed their sons on thrones. The empire was a vast network of hereditary power, and blood was its currency. At the same time, the search for the tomb continued. In 2012, a joint Mongolian-American team used satellite imagery to identify a large, rectangular structure buried in the Kentai Mountains. Excavations began, but the site turned out to be a Scythian burial ground from 2,000 years earlier. The tomb of Genghis Khan remained elusive. The mystery is part of the story. It keeps the Mongols alive in the imagination. Every failed expedition adds a new layer to the legend. Some Mongol scholars argue that the tomb should never be found. They say it is sacred. The ground where Genghis Khan was laid to rest should remain undisturbed, a place of peace for a man who gave the world war. But the historical questions remain unanswered. Without the tomb, we lack primary evidence about Genghis Khan's burial practices, his death, and the transition of power to his son Urgedei. We do not know if he was buried with treasure, with weapons, or with the 40 wives said to have accompanied him into the afterlife. The silence of the steppe is absolute. In the decades since the genetic study, other research has traced the lineage of Tamerlane, the Turkic conqueror who claimed descent from Genghis Khan. DNA from his alleged tomb in Samarkand showed that he carried a similar Y chromosome lineage, supporting the connection. The shadow of the Mongols extended into the 15th century and beyond. Yet the Mongol Empire did not just leave genetic markers. It left a political legacy that shaped the modern world. The Russian principalities absorbed Mongol methods of taxation, military conscription, and absolute rule. The Chinese Ming dynasty rebuilt a centralized state on the foundations of the Yuan. The Mughal Empire in India claimed descent from both Genghis Khan and Tamerlane. The Persian Safavids and the Ottoman Turks both inherited Mongol administrative practices. The empire also left a cultural paradox. The Mongols destroyed libraries in Baghdad and killed scholars in Nishapur. But they also employed Chinese physicians, Persian astronomers, and European craftsmen. They built an observatory in Maraghe. They commissioned the writing of the Secret History, the first known literary work in the Mongolian language. They printed paper money in China and issued coins in Persia. They were destroyers and patrons in equal measure. The question of why the empire collapsed is still debated. Some historians point to the lack of a fixed succession system. Others blame the fragmentation after Murnk's death. Still others argue that the empire was simply too large to survive without modern communication and transportation. The Mongols could ride, but they could not fly. Letters took months to cross the empire. A rebellion in one corner could not be suppressed before another broke out elsewhere. The final decades of the Mongol Empire were a slow unraveling. The Yuan dynasty fell in 1368. The Chagatai Khanate dissolved into warring tribes. The Ilkhanate collapsed into civil war and plague. The Golden Horde limped into the 15th century, but lost its grip on Russia after the Great Stand on the Ugra River in 1480. By 1500, the last independent Mongol Khanate, the Crimean Khanate, was a vassal of the Ottoman Empire. And yet the memory of the empire never died. It returned in the 20th century when the People's Republic of Mongolia resurrected Genghis Khan as a national hero after decades of Soviet suppression. His face appears on the currency, his statue guards the capital, and his name is spoken with reverence. The empire that once terrified the world is now a source of pride for the country that was its birthplace. What remains unanswered is the deeper meaning of the Mongol Empire. Was it a catastrophe that set back civilization by centuries, as some medieval chroniclers claimed? Or was it an era of unprecedented exchange that laid the groundwork for the modern globalized world? The evidence supports both views. The Mongols killed millions, but they also connected cultures that had never met. They burned libraries, but they also moved ideas across continents. They were ruthless, but they were also pragmatic. They built nothing permanent, but they changed everything. The empire ended not with a single battle or treaty, but with a long fade into legend. The writers,